Welcome to Nonfiction Insights. We're both going to be taking a really deep dive into a book that one of you shared with us, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson.
Exactly. So, Democracy Awakening, it's all about American democracy.
Of course, big topic, right?
Huge. And Richardson, she looks at some of the big challenges that we're facing in America right now, things like political polarization, the rise of misinformation, and even, some of the attacks that we've seen on democratic institutions. And she argues that actually these aren't totally new problems.
Right.
Richardson looks way back in American history, and she argues that there have always been these underlying tensions and conflicts that are kind of bubbling under the surface.
Okay, so this is a history book, but it's also super relevant to what's happening today. We can all agree on that, right?
Totally. I mean, she's writing about stuff from the 1930s, all the way up to the Trump presidency and even beyond.
Gotcha. Big sweep of history. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think the best place to start is with this core idea that Richardson puts forward, which is this fundamental conflict in American history, this tension between the ideal of equality and then, on the other hand, this persistent desire for hierarchy.
Okay, so two competing visions of America. On the one hand, you've got this beautiful ideal of equality, all men are created equal, all that good stuff. But then on the other hand, you've got this reality that, certain people have always had more power than others, whether it's based on race or wealth or social status.
Exactly. And, Richardson's point is that this tension, this struggle between those two visions, it really helps to explain a lot of the political conflicts that we've seen throughout American history.
So it's like a constant push and pull. So how does she kind of, make that idea concrete for people? Does she have like an example or a metaphor?
She does. So think of it like a seesaw.
Right.
One side of the seesaw is this ideal of equality, the idea that everyone deserves a fair shot. And then the other side is this idea of hierarchy, the idea that some people are just naturally meant to be on top. And American history is basically this constant back and forth between these two sides. Sometimes one side is up, sometimes the other side is up. But that tension is always there.
Yeah, I like that. That really helps visualize it's like this constant balancing act. Okay, so we've got this big idea of this core conflict in America between equality and hierarchy. And you mentioned that Richardson connects that to the challenges we're facing today, right? So, give us an example. How does this play out in a modern context?
Okay, so let's take the example of something like economic inequality, which we've seen a lot of in recent decades, right? Richardson would argue that this growing gap between the super rich and everyone else is a direct result of this tension between equality and hierarchy.
Okay, I can see that. So the idea is that, if we value hierarchy, then it makes sense that we would end up with a society where some people have way more wealth than others.
Yeah. It's like we've tilted the seesaw too far in the direction of hierarchy.
Yeah,
And,
right.
Richardson's point is that this isn't just bad for the people who are on the losing end of that equation. It's bad for democracy as a whole, because when you have such a huge concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, it undermines the idea of equal citizenship.
Right. And it probably makes it harder for people to actually have a meaningful voice in their government.
Exactly.
So we've got this big idea, right? This core conflict between equality and hierarchy. And we can see how that plays out in modern America. But Richardson is a historian, so she must trace that idea back in time, right? Where does she start?
She actually starts with a really interesting paradox. So she talks about the Declaration of Independence, which is obviously like this foundational document in American history. And it famously states that all men are created equal, right?
Right, one of the most famous lines ever written.
Exactly. But here's the thing. When the Declaration of Independence was written, slavery was still legal in America. So right from the start, you have this huge contradiction between this ideal of equality and the reality of a system that was based on racial hierarchy.
That's a great point. It's like this original sin that America has been grappling with ever since. So how does Richardson explain that? Does she just say that the founders were hypocrites?
Well, I mean, she definitely acknowledges that there was a lot of hypocrisy involved. But she also makes a really important point, which is that even though the founders were flawed, and even though they didn't live up to their own ideals in a lot of ways, the fact that they put those ideals out there in writing was incredibly significant.
Okay, so even though it wasn't reality at the time, just the fact that they said it, that they wrote it down, that made a difference.
Right. It set a standard. And, what's really interesting is that Richardson shows how throughout American history, different groups have used those words, those ideals from the Declaration of Independence to fight for their own rights.
Okay, so even though those words didn't initially apply to everyone, they kind of became this tool that people could use to push for a more inclusive vision of America.
Exactly. So, for example, in the 19th century, you had the abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery. And they pointed to the Declaration of Independence and said, hey, you said all men are created equal, so why are we still enslaving people? And then in the 20th century, you had the Civil Rights Movement, which was fighting for racial equality. And again, they pointed back to the Declaration of Independence and said, look, this document says that all men are created equal, so why are we still denying basic rights to Black people?
Yeah.
And even today, you have groups like the LGBTQ plus community who are fighting for their rights, and they're still using the Declaration of Independence to make their case.
That's powerful. So these words from hundreds of years ago are still having a real impact today.
Exactly. So, yeah, the founders were flawed, and they didn't always live up to their own ideals. But the fact that they articulated those ideals, that they put them out there, that created this incredible legacy that we're still grappling with today.
That's a really fascinating way to think about it. So we have this core conflict between equality and hierarchy, and we see that it's been present in America from the very beginning. So what happens next in the book?
Okay, so the next big idea that Richardson explores is the rise of what she calls conservatism as a specific reaction against equality. She argues that this really kicks into gear during the New Deal in the 1930s.
The New Deal. So we're talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and, all those government programs that were created to help people during the Great Depression. What does that have to do with conservatism?
Well, Richardson's point is that the New Deal was really a turning point because it represented a much more active role for the federal government in people's lives. And for a lot of people, that was a really radical idea.
I can imagine. Before the New Deal, the government was much smaller, and it didn't really do that much to help people, especially economically.
Exactly. So when FDR comes along and starts creating all these programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance, it's a huge shift. And of course, not everyone was happy about it.
Right. Makes sense. Change is hard. So who was opposed to the New Deal?
Well, Richardson argues that it was a coalition of different groups. So you had business leaders who didn't like all the new regulations that were being imposed on them. You had Southern Democrats who were really angry about the fact that some New Deal programs were actually trying to help Black people. And you had people in the West who were upset about the federal government's efforts to protect land and water resources.
Interesting. So like a pretty diverse group of people who, for different reasons, felt threatened by the New Deal.
Right. And Richardson points out that these groups started using the term conservative to describe themselves. But what's really interesting is that she argues that they weren't necessarily conservative in the traditional sense of the word. Like, they weren't really trying to conserve some long-standing tradition. Instead, they were mostly just reacting against this idea of a more active federal government. They saw it as a threat to their own power and interests.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And she actually draws this really interesting parallel between the way that these conservatives in the 1930s reacted to the New Deal and the way that slave owners in the 1850s reacted to the abolitionist movement.
Okay, that's an unexpected connection. So what's the link?
Well, in both cases, you had a group of people who were deeply invested in maintaining a system of hierarchy. In the 1850s, it was the slave owners who were benefiting from a system of racial hierarchy. And in the 1930s, it was these conservatives who were benefiting from a system of economic and social hierarchy. And in both cases, when they felt like their position of power was being challenged, they reacted by labeling their opponents as radicals.
That's like a classic tactic, right? If you want to discredit someone, just call them a radical.
Exactly. And Richardson points out that this tactic has been used throughout American history to silence dissent and to maintain existing power structures.
Yeah, and it makes me think about, like, even today, how often we hear people being called socialists or communists just because they support, things like universal health care or stronger environmental regulations.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like this playbook that gets dusted off and reused over and over again.
I know. It's like they don't even have to come up with anything new. So, okay. We've got this initial resistance to the New Deal, and then we see these groups start to coalesce around this idea of conservatism. But what happens next? How do we get from the New Deal to, like, the modern conservative movement that we know today?
Okay, so that's where Richardson brings in this other really important concept, which is what she calls movement conservatism. And she argues that this really starts to take shape in the mid-20th century.
Okay, so this is like the next stage of the evolution of American conservatism.
Exactly. And she argues that movement conservatism was much more organized and much more ideologically driven than the earlier opposition to the New Deal. It had specific goals and a clear vision for what America should look like. And a lot of that vision was shaped by figures like William F. F. Buckley Jr.
Oh, yeah, William F. Buckley Jr. He's like a legendary figure in conservative circles.
Yep. So Richardson talks about how Buckley and other intellectuals like L. Brent Bozell Jr., they were really concerned about what they saw as the growing influence of liberalism in American society.
And by liberalism, they meant.
Well, they basically meant anything that challenged traditional social hierarchies. So things like the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, all of that was seen as a threat to the established order. And, they were really concerned about the expanding role of the federal government. They thought it was becoming too powerful, too intrusive.
Okay, I could see that. So they wanted to push back against all of that, basically roll back the clock to a time when the government was smaller and social hierarchies were more firmly in place.
Yeah. And to do that, they realized they needed to build a movement, a real political movement that could challenge the liberal consensus that had dominated American politics since the New Deal.
And that's where this idea of movement conservatism comes in.
Exactly. So Richardson argues that Buckley and his allies were really good at building coalitions. They brought together different groups who, on the surface, might not have seemed to have that much in common.
So, who are we talking about here?
Well, you had business leaders who were worried about taxes and regulations. You had religious conservatives who were concerned about things like abortion and school prayer. You had white Southerners who were angry about the civil rights movement.
Okay, so that's a pretty diverse group of people.
It is. But Buckley was able to find common ground between these groups. He argued that they were all united in their opposition to what he called the liberal elite.
The liberal elite.
Yeah, this idea that there was this group of out-of-touch intellectuals and bureaucrats who were trying to impose their values on the rest of the country. And, Buckley was really good at tapping into this sense of resentment that a lot of people felt towards this so-called elite.
Okay, so it's like a classic populist strategy, right?
Yeah.
Create this us versus them dynamic and then position yourself as the champion of the people.
Yeah. And it worked. I mean, movement conservatism was incredibly successful. It really transformed American politics in the second half of the 20th century.
For sure. And Richardson doesn't shy away from talking about the darker side of that movement either, right? Like how they often used fear and resentment, especially around issues of race, to mobilize their base.
Exactly. Richardson doesn't pull any punches. She's very clear that this movement often relied on racist dog whistles and coded language to appeal to white voters who were anxious about the changing demographics of the country.
Yeah, and I'm thinking specifically about the Southern strategy here. How Nixon and other Republicans basically appealed to white voters in the South who were angry about the civil rights movement.
Right, and Richardson goes into detail about how this strategy was used to turn the South, which had been solidly Democratic for decades, into a Republican stronghold.
And this wasn't just about winning elections, right? It was about shaping a whole worldview, like a whole way of thinking about America.
Totally. And that worldview was very much rooted in this idea of hierarchy, the idea that some people, specifically white, Christian, heterosexual men, were naturally meant to be on top.
And that anyone who challenged that hierarchy was a threat to the real America.
Exactly. So to kind of recap here, we've gone from this initial opposition to the New Deal to the emergence of this much more organized and ideologically driven movement conservatism. And Richardson argues that this movement really set the stage for the political landscape that we see today.
Yeah, it's like a direct line from Buckley in the 1950s to Trump in the 2010s. So
Really?
how does Richardson connect those dots? How do we get from movement conservatism to, Trumpism?
Okay, so Richardson argues that there are a few key things that happened in the decades between the 1960s and the 2010s that really helped to create the conditions for someone like Trump to rise to power. And one of the biggest things was the increasing erosion of democratic norms.
Erosion of democratic norms. What does she mean by that?
So she's talking about things like respect for the rule of law, respect for the outcome of elections, a willingness to compromise, tolerance for dissenting viewpoints, things like that. And she argues that these norms started to really break down in the late 20th century.
Why? What caused that breakdown?
Well, she points to a few different factors. One is the rise of hyperpartisanship. As the two major political parties became more ideologically divided, it became harder for them to find common ground and to work together. Another factor is the increasing influence of money in politics. As campaigns became more expensive, politicians became more reliant on big donors, and that often meant that they were more responsive to the interests of those donors than they were to the interests of their constituents. And then, of course, you have the rise of social media, which has created these echo chambers where people can just surround themselves with information that confirms their existing biases.
Right. And it's made it really easy to spread misinformation and disinformation.
Exactly. So Richardson argues that all of these factors contributed to this erosion of democratic norms. And she says that by the time Trump came along, a lot of the guardrails that were supposed to protect our democracy had already been weakened.
Yeah. And then Trump basically just took a sledgehammer to those guardrails. He openly attacked the media. He questioned the legitimacy of elections. He encouraged violence against his opponents.
Yeah, it's like he saw all those norms and just decided to throw them out the window.
Exactly. And Richardson is really worried about the long-term consequences of that, right?
Yeah.
Because once you start to erode those norms, it's really hard to rebuild them.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's like if you keep driving over a speed bump, eventually that speed bump is going to get flattened out.
Yeah.
And then, what's going to slow people down?
Okay, I see your point. So we're at this point where democratic norms have been eroded, and then Trump comes along and really accelerates that process. What does Richardson say we can do about it? Does she offer any solutions?
She does. And actually, it's interesting because her solutions are both really simple and really challenging at the same time. So on the one hand, she says that we need to start by just reaffirming our commitment to democratic values. Like, we need to remind ourselves that democracy is about more than just winning elections. It's about respecting the rights of all citizens. It's about engaging in civil discourse. It's about upholding the rule of law.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. But how do we actually do that? I mean, it seems like we're so divided as a country right now.
Well, Richardson argues that we need to start by having honest conversations with each other. Even if we disagree with someone, we need to be willing to listen to them and to try to understand where they're coming from.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we need to be willing to call out bad behavior when we see it, even if it's coming from people who are on our own side. We can't just look the other way when our own side is engaging in, like, voter suppression or spreading misinformation.
That's a tough one. It's always easier to point the finger at the other side.
Yeah, for sure. It's uncomfortable. But Richardson is arguing that we have to be willing to hold ourselves and our own side accountable if we want to save our democracy.
I agree with that. It's like, if we're really serious about democracy, we can't just pick and choose which rules we want to follow.
Exactly.
Okay, so have honest conversations, call out bad behavior on our own side. What else?
Another really important thing that Richardson talks about is the need to rebuild trust in our institutions. In recent decades, we've seen a lot of attacks on things like the media, the judiciary, even the electoral process itself.
Right. People have lost faith in these systems that are supposed to be the foundation of our democracy.
Exactly. And Richardson argues that we need to start rebuilding that trust. And that's not going to be easy, but she says it's essential if we want to have a functioning democracy.
Yeah. So if we don't trust our institutions, then it becomes really easy for someone like Trump to come along and say, look, the system is rigged. The media is lying to you. The elections are stolen.
Right. And when people believe that stuff, it makes it really hard to have a productive political debate.
Okay, so we've talked about the need to reaffirm our commitment to democratic values, to have honest conversations, to call out bad behavior on our own side, and to rebuild trust in our institutions. Anything else?
One more thing. Richardson says that we need to remember that democracy is a constant struggle. It's not something that we achieve once and then it's done. It's something that we have to keep fighting for every single day.
That's a good point. Like, it's easy to get complacent and just assume that our democracy is going to be fine. But Richardson is saying that we can't take it for granted.
Exactly. We have to be vigilant. We have to be willing to stand up for what we believe in, and we have to be willing to work together, even with people who we disagree with, to protect our democracy.
Okay, so to summarize, we've got this big idea of this constant tension between equality and hierarchy in America. And Richardson traces that tension through history, all the way up to the present day. And she argues that we're at this really crucial moment right now where we need to decide what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country that embraces equality, or do we want to be a country that's ruled by hierarchy?
Right. It's a choice. And it's a choice that we're making every single day.
Exactly. Wow, that was a lot. I learned a lot.
I did too.
What a book.
Thank you for joining us today on the Nonfiction Insights channel.
Please subscribe to the Nonfiction Insights channel.